A very warm good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, viewers. I'm Matthias Aufiku, news editor of the Namibian Sun newspaper. Welcome to another exciting edition of the Evening Review Show. Well, tonight we speak matters of the media, the press that is. There is the conference on the future of journalism education in Southern Africa that's currently going on. It's a 3-day conference. And for that, we're joined in studio tonight by Mr. Frederick Links. He's a research associate at the IPPR. Mr. Links, welcome and good evening.
Welcome. Thank you, Matthias, and thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a pleasure to have you here, sir. Well, you were one of the panelists, I believe, at the ongoing conference. Can you just give us a brief summary as to what the conference is all about? Of course, we know it's about the future of journalism education in Southern Africa. Maybe you can just give us a brief rundown before we get into the gist of tonight's interview.
Yeah, so conference is mostly about looking at the state of journalism education in across the Southern African region, and the theme for yesterday was digital disruptions, crafting journalism education for viable media. Now, I mean, the overall theme the overall underlying of the conference over the next 3 days from the 15th to the 17th is that the issue of sustainability and viability of news media, especially journalistic media in Southern Africa, because I mean we all know that news media are under strain financially, these because of these shifts of the economic shifts that have taken place in the news media sector across the region, in Namibia included, and this has put financial strain on news media. It's impacted, sort of the quality of journalism, the range and scope of reporting and news production. So I mean, the conference is sort of aimed at trying to find answers to how sort of journalism education in the region can play a role in making news media sustainable.
Of course, when we speak education, it's a rather broad concept. Some would perhaps interpret for it to mean that when we speak of journalism education, is it the qualifications of journalists, or is it the role that the media has to play in terms of educating its stakeholders, the readers, and its general audience, be that as it may. But what specifically are we looking at when we say journalism education?
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, the conference, the various sessions, so the discussions around media viability, specifically the discussions around how to make media, news media, economically viable. There are discussions around, what is the state of journalism education and training at this point in time. And what should it be? How should journalism education and training be transformed? It's a complex discussion. I mean, it isn't just one aspect. And as you said, I mean, it's the overarching themes, broad themes, but various aspects under this theme of sustainability, of viability, are under discussion over these 3 days. So, I mean, well, the panel that I moderated looked at the issue of specifically the impact of declining journalistic credibility and trust, and its impact on media viability, on news media viability and sustainability. I mean, if there's a deterioration in trust, if the public doesn't trust the news media or journalists, then you can see how that impacts on the sustainability of news media organizations. So that, that was one specific aspect. Others look more at sort of the business aspects and what needs to be taught in terms of the business of journalism and so on. And others, do deep dives into the training programs that seem to point to potential success when it comes to training journalists of the future. So, I mean, it's a complex and sophisticated discussion, and a lot of it isn't settled. The answers aren't settled. This is an attempt to come up with answers. How to go about training a journalist for the moment, for this moment, and the moment of the future. So that's basically what it is, a really complex engagement with complex questions about journalism training and education.
Yeah. Well, the aspects of credibility and just accuracy has in recent years been a major talking point, especially amongst the public. Of course, the Afrobarometer has also showed that there's a decline in that aspect. What is the best way to deal with such a situation, and how do we remedy it as an industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've sort of pointed out for over a year now to my colleagues within the journalism sector. The issue of trust, and Afrobarometer round 8 actually points, sort of underscores the issue of trust and credibility. And in that specific, in the round 8 results, if you look at the media-related results, the round 8 results show that the perception amongst the respondents, let's say the public out there, when they were asked about who do they think mostly spreads fake news. Now, firstly, they said 67% said firstly it was social media users. And secondly, it's at about, I think about 65 or so percent, or 62%. 62% said journalists were spreading fake news. And in third place, with 60%, was politicians. I mean, so Namibians perceive journalists to be even less credible than politicians, which is, it's a strange thing. Looking at something like that, a perception like that. So, I mean, clearly there's a very high level of distrust of journalists in out there in our society. And that points to a credibility crisis. And, how we go about fixing that. That was sort of the point of the panel yesterday that I moderated. And there were various things sort of put on the table there for discussion. As I said, look, I mean, the answers, we don't have answers yet for some of these questions, especially this issue of trust. And some people say, on the one hand, taking journalists back to the basics, because in this era of digital reporting, corners are being cut to be first with stories online and on social media and so on, and accuracy has suffered, and it's become about engagement and clicks and so forth. So in that context, the accuracy, truthfulness has suffered. Not just here, of course, but I mean this is a big issue across the continent. And people have perceived journalists and news media organizations as being untrustworthy.
Yeah.
And of course, this is translated to audiences declining, and that has impacted on the economic viability of news media organizations.
Yeah.
So I mean, there were various things put on the table for consideration yesterday during this discussion. On how do we approach and remedy the credibility crisis that journalism is facing, and I mean, some as I said, nothing is settled, but we need to be talking about this, because this crisis just seems to be getting worse. More and more people are not engaging with with journalistic sort of journalistic products with the news. They're looking for the information elsewhere. They don't trust journalists.
Yeah.
And this is a concerning issue here and everywhere else on this continent.
Well, what do you make of claims by media critics who say that it seems as if traditional media is hiding behind the rise of social media to bury their shortcomings?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a response to that. Look, I mean, media organizations are trying to find, sort of their feet still. And in Namibia, I mean, Namibian news media organizations haven't really figured out yet how to use the internet and how to use social media. Not that any other news media organizations have done this optimally anywhere else, but others are producing more platform-specific content. I see that in Namibia, where you can see that news media organizations are producing platform-specific content that speaks to the audiences on specific platforms. And I mean, if you look at our news media organizations' websites, I mean, they're very basic. They're not very good websites across the board. And really the digital aspect in Namibia consists of media organizations taking what's in for instance, newspapers, taking what's in the newspaper and copy and pasting that onto the website, and that's it. That story is just copied and pasted the same story onto the website. And, I mean, that's sort of a very basic utilizing of the digital space for news dissemination.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're sort of at a very primitive stage in Namibia when it comes to producing for online and really producing content that people want to pay for online. So I mean, we certainly haven't figured out how to do things in a way that is really looks like money spinners in any sort of way, and that are economically sort of producing the goods. So I mean, this is and you probably, I mean, you're in a news organization, you probably know this better than me. So I mean, these are the concerns out there, and these are issues that I'm sort of not seeing our news media organizations really adequately grappling with it at this juncture.
Yeah. Just before we go for a break, would you say then this slow transition that you've just explained, is this part of the reason why the issue of viability and sustainability within the media sector is so crucial, and why media houses seems to be struggling financially?
Well, it's not just that. I mean, I think the business model is outdated, and that was something that was put on the table yesterday by Guy Berger, the Professor Guy Berger, the eminent media academic, and who's been with UNESCO trying to come up with UNESCO Paris, trying to come up with sort of programs to try and stave off the decline of news media and journalism over the last decade. And his view is very pointed. He says, I mean, it's not just that a failure to transition, to make the digital transition in sort of a smoother way. It's also the business models aren't changing. Media organizations are relying on an outdated business model to try and stay viable. They're not really innovating in the viability space. I mean, that's evident in the Namibian media landscape, as it is on other landscapes as well.
Yeah.
So there's very little innovation, and innovation that is linked to trying to find sustainable answers to the economic question of journalism.
Yeah.
In other markets, I mean, South Africa has some very good, and that this was also discussed at yesterday's during yesterday's deliberations. There's some really innovative news platforms out there. South Africa has some very innovative ones. So, I mean, these are things that we're not seeing this sort of innovation on the Namibian media landscape, and it's way beyond time that we started looking at being more innovative in news production and dissemination in the current context.
Yeah. Well, Frederico, we'll have for a short break and we'll continue this conversation, especially around the topic of how to adopt to the current times as far as the business model within the media sector is concerned. Well, to our viewers, we are out for a short break and we'll be back to continue this conversation.
The Agenda is a weekly national affairs interview program hosted by Namibian Sun editor Toyvon Jebela, featuring a panel of high-profile newsmakers, analysts, and experts. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact the Synergy marketing team at marketing@synergy.com.na or 061 297 2000.
NMH Ad 1 brings you news from all across Namibia. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact nmh1@synergy.com.na. NMH Ad 1, your lunchtime news companion.
Well, let me welcome our viewers back from this short break. Frederico, let's continue our conversation, especially on the issue of the business model and viability of the media sector. Of course, there is a thin line where we, as the media sector, can tread. Well, when it comes to business at least, and there is always that ethical considerations that one needs to consider. So how do we then navigate those stormy seas?
Look, I mean, this is not a question that I've sort of been seized with in any sort of serious way. It's sort of a fringe consideration that issue that I've been thinking about. How do we keep journalism, or how do we make journalism sustainable going forward? So, in terms of business models, I mean, you have to look at the size of your market and what works. Namibia is a very small market, and we're a low information society, and by that I mean our audiences aren't very sophisticated in their news media appetites and so on. I mean, it's also the role of the news media, of the journalistic media, to create some sort of sophistication in our news, and encourage our audiences to sophisticate their own tastes over time. And as people become more educated, they have different tastes in information and news and so on. So, I mean, these are things that speak to what sort of society are we operating in. And at the moment, I mean, we are a low information society where information is not really, especially written information. Us who come from a sort of a print-based journalism background. There's very little. There's a very small market for that sort of audience, and for those sorts of products. And so there's only so much you can tap out of that market. I think. I mean, as someone who managed and edited a magazine for most of a decade, and then watched the magazine fold because of largely economic pressures. You see what the limits of how far you can go with your platform. For instance, in my example, Inside Namibia magazine, which was a monthly current affairs magazine, and it's only goes so far, and we had to start to the point where we had to start innovating to remain relevant, to remain economically sustainable. And right at that point, sort of the national economic conditions turned on us, and we had this prolonged economic deterioration from about early 2016, which still persists today, of course, and COVID has just exacerbated this. So you have to. So these are all considerations that have now come to impact on the viability, the sustainability of journalistic media, of news media organizations. And really, I mean, it's a situation now where organizations have to move, and some have to move faster than others to find answers, to break things, to innovate, to disrupt. They've been doing things and so on. Because I mean, once again, if you look at what people said in Afrobarometer in the last two rounds, round 8 and round 9, especially when it comes to the print-based media, print was at the bottom of the pile when people said, where you get your news on a basis. And print newspapers were right at the bottom. It was something like just over 20%. I think it was 23%.
Yeah.
And that these are things that organizations, our news media organizations, especially our print-based news media organizations, where a lot of the good news, the good stories, are being, the really good stuff is coming out, the investigations and so on. There's a declining readership. There's an inability, it seems, to retain and attract new readers. So the business models and innovations that have to happen around models really need to be engaged with and grappled with at this point in time, especially against all the noise that's coming by internet. And levels of mis and disinformation spreading, and that's also impacting on the sustainability and viability of news media organizations, because it has an impact on how people perceive the news media as just another voice out there creating. So I mean, this is something that really needs to be engaged with seriously by our journalistic news.
Yeah. Just lastly, Frederico, the issue of, we've spoken about the issue of the media not really harnessing or transitioning fast as far as moving towards a digital newsroom is concerned. But we also know the realities on the ground, especially in our setup as Namibia, the internet challenges and so on. So how do you balance that to where you have still a large number of your audience still having internet access as a luxury instead of really a basic commodity? So how do you balance that situation?
Yeah, I mean that's a question that I think offers an opportunity for news media organizations, for news media managers and researchers and so on, to come together and really talk about this issue. How do you do this? Now, one of the suggestions, proposals that has been made in this regard is, looking at your market and the digital, the potential for digital news media dissemination and so on, and internet penetration and the like at this point in time. Perhaps for markets such as Namibia, it would be a good idea to try and regionalize, to create additional readers outside of Namibia, to expand coverage in that way. Sort of, what if Namibian media organizations expanded their coverage to include Botswana and Zambia and so on. In that way, because of the limitations on the local market, try and capture markets in neighboring countries and create media products that speak to the markets in those countries. Perhaps that's one way. But I mean, these are questions that I think Namibian news media organizations really need to, come together with media researchers and academics and probably have some sort of indaba around what do we do? How do we answer these difficult questions? How do we go into the future and still remain standing? So this is, these are questions that I'm going to throw them back at you and your organization and other organizations, news media organizations. There really needs, because I don't see a lot of activity in trying to answer these questions, to be honest, from our news media sector and from our academic sector. I get the sense that we're looking to others to come up with the answers, and then we'll adopt and adapt some of these things. But we're not really investing in innovation or answering these questions in any sort of substantive sense. And that's just my sense. I could be wrong. I mean, but that's just my sense, and standing and observing what's happening on media sector, who's invested in some way in journalism and engages in and it concerns me. But I'm open to being wrong if our organizations are seriously grappling and substantively grappling with these questions. And not just finding ways to remain sort of relevant and how I hang on to what they have and so on, and to continue going through the motions of putting out every day. So I mean, I'm going to throw that back at you and your organization and other news media organizations.
Yeah. Now, Frederico, thank you very much for your time this evening and for your input. We highly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, and have a pleasant evening. Well, to our viewers, that's it from the Evening Review team. Have a pleasant evening. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Thank you.